Luke, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak today. You're doing a lot of awesome stuff there in Maryland, and kudos to you and to your lab and all the work you guys are doing. That's pretty exciting stuff to see you have going on there. And again, thanks for everybody coming out and attending today, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have. I will make a quick caveat here. I am not an expert on conservation cooperatives. We were just working on this effort and trying to find ways that we can help improve conservation in ag-dominated landscapes. But I am working with colleagues who actually have more experience in this realm. Most of my training is in wildlife biology, wildlife management, but it's such a huge need that this is an area that I'm really passionate about. And you'll learn that kind of throughout the presentation, my passion for just conservation in ag-dominated landscapes. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump in, see if my little clicker here will work. Let's see if this will go. There we go. All right. So wanted to go through just briefly. Luke mentioned, so I run the Awesome Lab. And we had to come up with something that was kind of crafty that people would remember because we had such a long name, Applied Wildlife Ecology and Spatial Movement Lab. So Awesome came up, and that was kind of a nice way to use as an acronym. I'm going to talk about Midwestern landscapes, but I'm going to argue that this is really really not only a national, but really a global issue. And I wanted to focus just, per se here on Midwestern, just to kind of give you some examples, but you'll be able to kind of put maybe your landscape there. I'm originally from Pennsylvania. I grew up in Gettysburg area, so they're kind of south central Pennsylvania. So I'm fairly familiar with that. Maryland, Pennsylvania area, being that I grew up there for over 20 years. I was in that area. So then we're going to jump into conservation cooperatives, what that is, and then ultimately, where do we go from here? How do we find balances for conservation in ag-dominated landscapes? So again, as Luke noted, we have the Awesome Lab. If you want to go follow us on our social media outlets, Facebook, X, Instagram, you can go just take and Google at Awesome Lab or go to any of those accounts, those social media accounts, and take and do at Awesome Lab, and you'll find us. But one of the things that we are very, very focused on with our mission is providing applicable science to help landowners and management agencies balance the needs really of ag-dominated landscapes. So we got to feed and fuel the growing world, but at the same time ensuring we can create healthy, robust ecosystems for future generations. So you'll hear me use the terminology a lot, finding the balance. And that's really where the kind of the nexus of where a lot of our research and extension efforts are here within the state of Nebraska. So again, go follow us there in Awesome Lab. Also, and I'll plug this again at the end, we just launched effective last Monday, the Wild Ag Podcast. You can go to any of your popular streaming platforms, Apple, Spotify, etc., and take and follow us on their Wild Ag Podcast. And I'll note it again at the end, this is a really focused on conservation professionals and ag and really landowners as a whole, but especially in ag-dominated landscapes, all around soil, water, and wildlife. So again, finding those balances for all those things, soil, water, and wildlife together. So, all right. So as I noted, I'm going to focus a little bit on Midwest because that's where I'm at in Nebraska, but I would argue this is pretty ubiquitous across not only the nation, but around the world, where we're trying to feed and fuel a growing world while at the same time ensuring the sustainability of our natural resources. So one of the substantial challenges that we face today, not only locally here in Nebraska, but globally, is habitat loss and degradation. So we're losing habitat at a rapid rate. You see statistics like in the New York Times not too long ago, they had an article on grassland birds and seeing a decline in grassland bird populations across the nation, a lot of that being attributed to habitat loss. So the question is, well, how do you address that? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. We also have increased landscape fragmentation. So this is actually from a county in Nebraska where the yellow is all basically either corn or bean production. So it's all under ag production of some sort. And then the green are basically intact grassland patches. This is national land cover data that's available. And so you have these intact patches on the landscape for various species, say grassland songbirds or, game birds. But most of your landscape looks like this, especially in these ag-dominated landscapes. And so I use an example, you could have a pheasant, you could have a quail, you could have, whatever type of species you want to plug in there. But if you're trying to get from point A to point B and you're in such a highly fragmented landscape, how do you do that? The assumption is that, okay, they may move through those areas when the crops are up, and that can be true. But at the same time, when those crops are down in the wintertime, when those fields are fallow, how do they get from point A to point B? I think that's a really important thing to consider. We obviously have soil erosion issues that we see in our ag-dominated landscapes. As I noted before, we have declining wildlife populations. This is one of the articles that I referred to just a moment ago in the New York Times about birds that are vanishing, particularly grassland birds. You see these substantial declines of birds across the nation and really across the globe as well, just various wildlife populations. And so the question is, how do we address all of this? Because there is a lot of interconnection amongst these things. In Nebraska, we also have water quality issues. I think there's a number of states that are have initiative to address water quality challenges. But one of the things we have is we have high nitrate concentrations in portions of our state, denoted by the red here. So that's a substantial challenge that we're faced with. How do we address that moving forward? Well, all of that from the natural resource side combined then with we have a growing world population. So by 2050, we're going to have almost 10 billion people, and I think maybe estimates now are actually over 10 billion, which estimates are considering is somewhere between a 40 to 50+% increase in food production to be able to meet that global demand. And so the question really comes down to like, well, where are you going to find that? And so that's essentially what the rest of this talk is going to focus on is how do you find that balance between ag and conservation? Because I think it's one of the most critical challenges that we face here in the 21st century is finding that balance so we can ensure we can feed and fuel the growing world, but at the same time, we can ensure the sustainability of our natural resources. And that's also compounded with things like climate change and other factors that are added into that equation. So again, we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of kind of finding that balance and kind of doing that in a way through conservation cooperatives. I will argue that there is no cookie cutter approach for conservation. Every property you go to, and Luke can attest to this, in his role, every property is different. Every property is going to have unique, natural resource challenges, unique, maybe soil types, vegetation types, other topography, things like that, that are in turn going to basically require a kind of a unique approach to ensure that we can kind of best manage resources on those properties. So again, you're not going to necessarily find this kind of cookie cutter approach everywhere. So this is where conservation cooperatives, or in the UK, they actually term them farmer clusters, can play a role. And really the idea is, working together. And this is not a novel concept. This has been around literally for decades. So it's what I'm presenting today is not a novel thing. It's really just kind of, continuing to bring light to the need to work with your neighbors to achieve landscape level conservation success. So traditionally, when we think about like conservation enrollment, for example, so say the landowner wants to go in and enroll in a conservation program, they go to the FSA office and they can work with them. They can have an NRCS biologist come out and give some recommendations. What we tend to see is kind of get patches of land enrolled at various places on the landscape. And that's great. And I want to continue to see those efforts, expanded. But the one challenge is they can be separated. They may not necessarily always be close by each other. And so that creates some challenges. And particularly one of the examples is this idea from the Field of Dreams. If you guys remember back to Field of Dreams movie, if you build it, they will come. And so the assumption sometimes, and I've had folks that have said this, it's like, well, hey, I was trying to do this conservation program to maybe boost a certain species, but I'm not necessarily seeing the impact that I was hoping for. Well, when you kind of zoom out and kind of look at that at like a landscape level around their property, maybe 5 to 10 miles around, maybe that's the only intact patch of, say, perennial vegetation on that landscape. Maybe everything else is so highly fragmented, back to one of my earlier photos, that if you're an animal trying to get from point A to point B and you're not an incredibly mobile species, then you're kind of limited to those remnant patches that are left on the landscape. So that's the question that I get is, what happens when you build it and your species of interest, doesn't come? And that's where I wanted to kind of highlight an image that I just described here, is maybe you have some conservation efforts you're doing, but then you zoom out and you're like, well, how does that pheasant, for example, or how does that quail, or how does that, whatever species you want to plug in there, how do they get from that one point on the landscape to somewhere else? So I'll just kind of skip through this one here, but the idea again is to look at this, with a pheasant and kind of how you get from that point to point. And so that's really where landscape context is critical, and thinking about these patches. And this is Rudnick et al. 2012. You can see here that these dark green patches are essentially those intact vegetation patches, and then the light green are kind of corridors amongst these patches. And so I've had conservation professionals ask me about that, is, could we also incentivize these corridors as well? And you see that, especially in some of the western states for ungulates, like, think about like mule deer or elk that migrate. They'll actually establish basically migrational corridors for conservation efforts to get from kind of these winter grounds to those kind of spring, summer grounds where those animals will reside. And so similarly, in an ag-dominated landscape, this is that kind of idea. You got these intact patches, and then you have corridors to get amongst them on the landscape. So you kind of learned a little bit of background there of kind of this idea of, what conservation cooperatives can do and kind of how that, and we're going to kind of dive a little bit deeper into it, but like what the need is, I should say, for conservation cooperatives. And so in the UK, as I noted, there is a lot of work on this termed farmer clusters. And I really like the quote that they had out of one of their documents from the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust that's in England. They basically talk about that this is a farmer cluster or conservation cooperative, is basically just a group of farmers or landowners living in that same area. They're working together, they're sharing their knowledge, they're helping motivate each other around improving biodiversity and the ecological health of their farms. And in Iowa, they have the Practical Farmers of Iowa. It's another group here in the States. But the idea, again, is people working together to solve these complex problems. Is it easy? I can tell you this, and I'll have a slide here in a little bit about that. No, it's not. It's obviously very complicated. But the point is that this can be a way to be able to address the challenges that we face with trying to feed and fuel the world while ensuring the sustainability of our world for future generations. So I'll see if I can play this little video that this was actually out of some of that work over in the UK. I think this was really kind of helpful video. And so I use that video and thank the partners that, again, I'm not a part of that per se, and I just have, this is an effort that really has started over there in the UK, and they're really building that out. And so it's been really exciting to see, and I've been chatting with some of them via email about some of their initiatives, and that was one of the videos that they had shared out to share as a part of their presentations. And they said that this is something that's been really growing. There's a lot of interest over there. And so kind of adopting some of these ideas. And so this is where, as I noted at the beginning of my presentation, I'm not an expert in this realm, but I'm learning, I'm working through it. And this is with my extension program at the University of Nebraska. I'm 60% extension, 40% research, and I'm very passionate about this idea of conservation cooperatives and just conservation as a whole in ag landscapes. And so they actually have some really great documents out there about how do you set these up. And I'll use the example here locally within Iowa, the Practical Farmers of Iowa. It's basically, again, it's the landowners that are really leading these efforts. The conservation professionals are a part of that equation. They're providing the science. They're working with those landowners, but they are, the landowners in and of themselves are basically driving this to be able to improve adoption across the landscape. And so that's where you can kind of read here about these different, they have a little scenario about how they set up these farmer clusters. But the idea is that then again, they're working together to share knowledge about what works and what doesn't. And the more that you can do that and working as a network, the more one you can take and find those opportunities to balance conservation in ag landscapes. And then two, basically saying, hey, how can we feed and fuel this world in a way that maybe we hadn't done traditionally? That we can kind of think outside of the proverbial box and kind of be creative, leveraging things like precision ag technology, and finding opportunities for conservational marginal acres, for example. So again, just kind of thinking a little bit broader than maybe what we've done in the past per se, in part because of technology advancements that we have now with a lot of our equipment that these individuals are using. So like I said, these are efforts, and I will definitely credit that to the folks there in the UK, a part of this framework effort. They're the ones that have developed these tutorials, these scenarios, and kind of working with landowners. They just have been very kind to let me utilize some of the material to be able to share it out and kind of hope so we can continue to adopt some of these things over here in the U.S. So they have some other initiatives. So as I mentioned, this is a very farmer-led scenario, and then they have others where they actually have the conservation professionals are helping kind of lead that effort, and then they bring in farmers as a part of that, and then they begin to develop these networks out in collaboration with these various external organizations, conservation-led organizations, universities, et cetera. So really, the vision that I have and in the awesome lab we have is collectively is we have to move from kind of the single conservation efforts on a farm to kind of this landscape level. Going back to that original image that I had where the landscape was highly fragmented, you have to find ways to be able to have individuals working together in a kind of a smaller spatial area, and then hopefully bridging or expanding that out. Again, it's not going to happen like a ripple in the pond effect because there's going to be other challenges that come into play. One thing that is a challenge that in some states, and Nebraska has experienced this, is obviously we have a lot of tenants and essentially kind of this non-operating landowners. So somebody who owns land, but then they lease that land out. And so then that creates an additional challenge. But I do think there's opportunities there for these type of conservation cooperatives. Again, it just is another component to the puzzle per se. And eventually moving towards what I described earlier through this image by Rudnick et al. 2012 of kind of creating that connectivity of those patches and corridors so that animals and these wildlife species that we're managing for can move amongst these areas. But at the same time, we can also have benefits to our soil, our water, etc. All right, so now that we kind of learned a little bit about conservation cooperatives and the challenges that we face, I want to kind of spend some time just highlighting some research that we did here in Nebraska about where farmers get their information from, farmers and farmland owners, and how that plays into this conversation. So there's a lot of interest around precision conservation and precision conservation delivery and producer relations and how we can understand the conservation decision making of producers. And so a few years ago, we launched a project funded by the Nebraska Environmental Trust here in Nebraska that focused on farmers and farmland owners' attitudes of targeted conservation delivery. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through all the details of our research per se, because we have a lot of different components, but I will highlight some of the work that we did and some of the results and how this plays into the conservation cooperative idea. So in 2022, we had administered a survey to over 7,500 farmers and farmland owners in Nebraska. We got over 1,000 of those that were returned. A little side note is we found that we just did a little study to see if we put a pen in the envelope, if we would get more of them returned, and we actually did. So having a writing utensil with your survey was definitely an important thing. But we asked them a series of 18 questions and 14 precision ag and 5 producer-focused characteristic questions. But one of those questions that we obviously wanted to know was where are they getting their information primarily from? And not surprisingly, we get the information, or everybody gets their information from their family, their friends, their peers that are working with. You can go to a local coffee shop and you can find this kind of scenario illustrated in this picture. You know, people spending time together, having coffee, talking about the weather, talking about various, things going on in the community. And this is where it really starts, is having those individuals that are working, they're getting information from their peers. So my student, Corin Winter, who has since graduated, she's a master's student, her results out of this study illustrated the need for farmer-led initiatives like conservation cooperatives. Producers are going to go to their peers to get this information. Again, not necessarily a big surprise, but ultimately that's important as we're building this idea on conservation cooperatives. So if you want more species like pheasants or quail or turkeys or you name it there, then farmers and farmland owners must lead that effort. I think it's important for conservation professionals to be a part of that equation, but it really comes down to those farmers are going to be able to connect with their peers. And think about it too, is not only are they having coffee, they're going to sporting events with their neighbors' kids, as they're, those families are basically, some of those families could be in those communities for 100+ years. So they've known each other for years. And that's where you're going to see change, is when you see those individuals adopting these efforts and working with their peers and their family members and such to be able to implement conservation strategically in the landscape. But it needs to be objective driven. Can also leverage precision technologies, and I won't spend time on that, but I do some other presentations focused on using precision ag technologies to help with that. But also, one of the things I also tell people is to think beyond your property border. Think beyond just managing your, say, 50 or 100+ acres, and think about your neighbors. Think about what they have to offer as well. Because as we, wildlife don't know boundaries. And so they're going to move amongst properties. And so the more that we can work together, the better off at the end of the day. But as I noted earlier in the presentation, it's very complicated. There's no silver bullet, no easy button. It's challenging at the end of the day. And so the question comes down to, we have to find that balance. As we're seeing this increase to over 10 billion people, we have to find innovative ways to tackle this challenge of feeding and fueling our world and ensuring the sustainability of our natural resources for future generations. So the question then is, and kind of the remainder of the presentation I want to focus on, is where do we go from here? You guys are aware now of kind of what conservation cooperatives are, the challenges we face, kind of how some of that research plays into it. I wanted to focus on kind of 3 areas to improve adoption of conservation in ag landscapes. The first being connecting conservation professionals together. I think is really important, especially with COVID, people really got isolated, and getting people back together and connecting together. Improving educational and production ag systems, and I'll note that here in a moment. Improving connections amongst our landowners. We obviously already have those connections through coffee shop engagements and things like that, but then expanding that to these conservation cooperatives, landowner focused workshops, etc. And then lastly, we'll focus on, for the remaining time, is this collaborative networks, creating them amongst landowners, conservation professionals, et cetera, to engage and solve complex challenges that we face in our systems today. So one way we've done this, I was fortunate enough to be a speaker for the Nebraska Conservation Practitioner Symposiums that were held back in August of 2023, this past August. The idea was we wanted to create synergy by partnering together as a conservation community. So the attendees that were at these events were conservation professionals from really a variety of different organizations, such as Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever, the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, USDA, NRCS, et cetera. A lot of different conservation professionals that are coming together to really connect, especially like as I noted at the beginning there, with COVID, that really isolated folks. And so there were a lot of new professionals as well that were coming in, and they just did not know that there were other people working maybe in their arena, or for maybe just a partnering organization, because they hadn't had the chance to really get to meet them yet. And so that was kind of the idea of this forum, was to have these across. And you can see we had 6 of them across the state of Nebraska as a whole. And so we got to talk with these conservation professionals around some of the pressing things that we need to address in our society today from the natural resource side of things. But a lot of it was just connection opportunities. So they had various tables that they moved around to, and they basically got to meet each other and kind of learn about what each other was doing, and kind of talk about some of the conservation challenges that we're facing, and some of the ways that their organizations were actually using various things to address those challenges. We then built onto that workshop here this basically a month ago with this Natural Resources Conservation Connecting Points workshop. This workshop was focused, again, kind of expanding that effort, but also by also bringing in university professionals as well. So we had individuals represented from various units on our campus. So within the University of Nebraska, we have Lincoln, we have the Institute of Ag and Natural Resources. And within there, you have programs like animal science, ag horticulture, ag economics, school natural resources, et cetera. And so bringing those folks together with our conservation professionals to talk about opportunities for collaboration. We had over 100 people attend this one-day event. We had a meeting facilitator, very similar to the practitioner symposium, in a sense that we had people move around from table to table, meeting new people. We also had students as a part of this, because I think that's really important that we get our students in our undergraduate programs and graduate programs engaged on these conservation challenges, and getting them to meet potentially future employers as well. Like I said, we walked away from this event highlighting the need to continue to expand on this through a variety of avenues, and I'll lead into one of them here from the landowner side in a moment. But one of the things that's also come up quite a bit that I've learned since I started my position here a few years ago is training opportunities, or the need for that, for conservation professionals on production ag systems. You have individuals that come out that may have no background at all with production ag systems. Maybe they didn't grow up on a farm. They are not from an ag-dominated state. And so myself and a handful of colleagues, a couple of years or so ago, we developed a class called Introduction to Production Ag. You can see here on the screen, they have a cropping system section, and then they had a rangeland section for the livestock side of things. But it was really designed, as you can see here, for those a little to no experience with crop production practices. And it got attendees out so they could come and meet with these production ag professionals and go through, like, here's what a planter is, here's how this planter works, here's how a combine works. This, again, familiarizing yourself with, these production ag systems and kind of what goes into them. And then at the same time, I was also, as a part of, like, you can see a couple of these pictures here, spend some time in the classroom talking about, precision conservation in ag landscapes, but then actually going out in this image right here, I'll show you in a second, with some of our prairie strip initiatives that we're doing, and showing students how we're actually getting conservation on the landscape in that way. But this was also then actually this past year expanded to be open to the general public, so other people could attend who were interested in just production ag systems. And to be honest, I grew up in a production ag system in South Central Pennsylvania. I did not grow up on a farm. So I learned a lot just of myself going to this and just about these production ag systems. So it was a very educational opportunity for people. And then kind of transitioning a little bit from the land to the landowner side, and my second bullet point I just talked about a moment ago, is that conservation cooperatives and managing beyond your property boundary. We have a project right now, and I'm going to show a brief video here in a second on the Nebraska Prairie Strip Initiative. This is in collaboration with Iowa State and a larger grant that they have. But we're looking to get farmer testimonials because I think those are incredibly powerful as well, to be able to share to folks about, hey, this worked really well, or maybe this didn't work, or here's why I'm doing this, to be able to get that information out to the public as a whole. And then we're also looking with our lab right now to develop some of these farmer clusters or these cooperatives here in the state of Nebraska. There are some that are already existing through other collaborations with our conservation agencies, and continue to partner with them and finding ways that we can start collecting some data on those farmer clusters and finding ways to make them more efficient and more successful over time, and hopefully create a model that then in turn can be adopted by other states across the nation as well as globally. I guess one thing I wanted to show you is a quick video of some work we've been doing here to highlight that conservation and ag landscapes. And we're actually going to have some field days for farmers and landowners this coming summer into early fall around this. And I wanted to kind of share this video because I think it helps share kind of start wrapping up our presentation today of kind of the points of finding that balance. So I'll play this.
Agriculture, conservation, is art of cozy ideas. Prairie strips can help reduce soil erosion, improve water quality, and provide wildlife habitat on your land. Strategically placed to maximize your ROI while creating a healthy ecosystem. Now, for the first time, you can see prairie strips at your Nebraska Research and Extension Centers.
So that gives you kind of an idea there of some of the initiatives that we're working on here in Nebraska, and just kind of to help, get the landowners, engaged around some of these conservation opportunities. But then we're also working on an initiative based on that conservation connecting points workshop here a month ago, on a landowner focused workshop around conservation. And it's going to be led by and for landowners. And we will have conservation professionals a part of the planning team, but we want landowners a part of that, so that they can basically help, address, what are those things that they want to know from conservation organizations, as well as extension, university extension, et cetera, around kind of finding this balance. Ultimately, we have to come back to that landowners. It's important to have them as a primary piece of this, and they're really leading these initiatives, which is why those efforts in, say, the UK or with Practical Farmers of Iowa have been so successful, because they're led by farmers in most cases. They're led by those landowners that are actually taking these initiatives, and they're running with it, and they're working with their peers. And then lastly, to wrap up here, creating a collaborative network. And I put in here University of Nebraska Extension, but you could really put any other university extension in their logo. But the idea is to, working to create these collaborative networks, kind of these bridges to get producers, maybe if it's in focus groups or if it's in kind of kind of think tanks, if you want to call it, but working with conservation professionals, working with their state, federal, NGO partners, ag industry, university extension, all of them. We have to be able to work together to resolve the challenges that we face here in the 21st century, and continue to advance our conservation efforts in ag landscapes. And it's so critical that we have voices from all those different groups at the table, so we can come up with solutions that are going to be able to be successful as we move forward here in the 21st century. So to kind of complete the presentation here, I end on just a couple of quick slides saying, be creative. Producers are now starting to think about designing stackable enterprises where they're finding opportunities for things like hunting leases, bird watching opportunities, other recreational activities, to maybe beyond their traditional kind of base income from farming. And so thinking about ways to create those stackable enterprises and being innovative, those local economic development opportunities that come to fruition through these efforts can really create some exciting opportunities to expand conservation across the country. And I'll do a quick shout out again to our Wild Ag podcast, because we tackle a lot of these things that we just discussed for the past 30, 40 minutes. And go check that out on your favorite outlets and learn a little bit about soil, water, and wildlife research and opportunities that from landowners as well, that what things they're doing to advance conservation. So I'll just end on this slide. This is out of our strategic discussions for Nebraska book that gets disseminated to thousands of folks across the state. And this was a quote that I had from in there from this past year. The importance of this collaborative research and extension efforts and working together as a community. So with that, Luke, I think I'll turn it over to you, and I'm happy to entertain any questions. If you want to reach out to me, you can, here's my information. I know Luke probably had that out there as well, but here's that information too. So.
Thank you, Andy. Great talk, really interesting. Love to see the workshops you're holding. I remember when you showed that connecting points workshop, it looked like it was a really cool one and well attended.
Yeah.
And no, thanks for sharing that email. We did not have your email up on there. So yeah, if anybody wants to reach out to Andy, he's out in Nebraska, but he actually is. You grew up in Pennsylvania, right?
I did. Yeah, I grew up in Gettysburg area, just north of Gettysburg. So.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and this is the other thing is part of why I kind of built into the passion of where I'm at today. Two really key things. One is I was very involved in FFA, Future Farmers of America, and as well as 4-H. And then my dad was a water quality specialist in Pennsylvania for the Department of Environmental Protection. So I learned a lot in my early years that really kind of birthed that passion for conservation in our ag landscape. So
cool. I am starting to, Andrew, how we're always looking to evaluate our program. So I'm going to pop into the chat. I got a question from Anthony here, but I'm putting into the chat a survey you can fill out. Let us know what you liked, rate us on what you learned, and give us ideas for future stuff you'd like to hear about.
Absolutely.
And Anthony Antonucci asks, what kind of progress are you making in getting farmers to buy in on these conservation practices?
Yeah, that's a great question.
And he's got a few additional things.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
I'll read the whole thing to you. It says,
go ahead,
you're targeting small farmers and not big ag farms. Also, where are you encountering roadblocks or opposition to your efforts? By what groups? Thank you for the presentation. Thanks for the efforts and passion for promoting conservation and saving the environment. So there's a few questions. I can go back through them if you want.
Yeah. So yeah, Anthony, thanks. That's a great a few questions there. I'm kind of looking here to chat too, Luke. So looking at that, one of the questions there, what kind of progress are you making getting farmers to buy in? I think it's the challenge is always there's no cookie cutter approach. There's definitely a lot of interest, and I feel if you want to say the tides of changing, there's just so much excitement around some of these efforts. I think the challenge it comes down to is obviously from a production standpoint, farmers are going to do what the markets are telling them. So if the markets are telling them they need to have more corn and beans, for example, then it's going to be more corn and beans and I use that because that's what we see a lot here, and especially in the eastern part of Nebraska. So I think that's why I go. It's complex. It's not like an easy silver bullet to fix because you have ag industry and kind of the with the markets and kind of like your companies out there that are buying products from these different producers. There's a lot of different moving pieces. So the decision making process for producers is very complex, and it's not really easy. So there's definitely there's growing interest. I think that I think it just takes time. I think that's one of the things I didn't share, and I always like to emphasize this is that we live in an instantaneous culture. We have, you get on your phone and you can Google something in a split second, and that's great. But conservation takes time, and I think that that's one of the things that's always important to kind of keep in the back of our minds is, yes, we want an instantaneous change, but it may take years to get some of that change. The most important thing is that you're moving in that positive direction, and that's where we're heading right now. So hopefully that answered that. Probably a little long-winded there, but um, and in regards to kind of smaller or bigger farmers, big farms, yeah, I think it really depends. I think if there are producers that are at that larger scale that are leveraging, especially the ag technology. I've met with producers and they say that they don't make any decisions without that, or basically in the absence of any of that data-driven technology. And so thinking about, hey, I don't have to put the same rate of nitrogen, for example, on my field or other maybe herbicide or pesticide, I can take and strategically place that now because the technology, and a lot of them tend to be probably some of those bigger producers that can afford some of that technology. So hopefully that answered. Yeah, and I guess there are roadblocks as like anything. It's just there's always challenges that you're going to encounter for a variety of reasons. But I do see, like I said, that there's definitely a positive trend for increased interest and adoption of these efforts, especially if it comes back to the economic side. If it benefits you financially to make some of those decisions, that's where you're gonna make sense. Like you're gonna want to do those things. So.
Cool. We have a few other questions coming in on the Q&A side.
Sure.
Jenny asked, and I think Jenny, I'm wondering if that's Jenny Rosenkrantz. She's one of our extension folks. She says, are the prairie strips most often created along streams or waterways?
Yeah, great question. So it depends on where. So a lot of cases I would argue they're not always around water strips. So they're what the initiative started. So it's actually just so folks are aware. So prairie strips, it's actually in the Farm Bill now. It's CP 43. It's a lot higher diversity of forbs in there, forbs and legumes in the mixes. So actually in those prairie strips I did that video, we actually have a couple of treatments in each. So we have like an average diversity, and then we have a high diversity mixtures of forbs and legumes and grasses in there. And the idea was that we wanted to be able, and I worked with NRCS and Pheasants Forever biologists to custom design those mixes relative to those geographical areas in the state. We actually have prairie strips, like I noted in there, 3 locations. As of last year, we actually have 2 more research and extension centers that they're going in or have already gone in this year of 2024, which is exciting. So back to the questionnaire, yeah, it kind of depends a little bit, but the ultimate thing is basically trying to implement about 10% of corn and bean fields was kind of the initial initiative. They targeted corn and bean fields because it started in Iowa in prairie strips. And what they used to do or still do is they would put them kind of on the down slopes of those fields where they obviously have a lot of topography for those fields, and then that would help stop or help address that erosion so all that soil is not running the whole way down into those creeks. So they can be around those waterways, but a lot of times they'll actually be embedded on those hillsides and such. So
yeah, we have I'd say what's most common out here is we do a lot of field border edges, which I think is another CP practice.
Yep.
But I will be starting to plug that prairie strip concept. It's a cool one, and it can get some connectivity in places where the field borders might not quite do the same.
Sure.
Depending on the layout of the land.
And it's not, again, all these things are not going to fix all of the challenges we have, but it's a tool. I always say, and as Luke, you'd probably attest to, a lot of times we have a lot of tools in the toolbox. And so that's where we're at. This is a tool in our toolbox per se.
Yeah. Somebody asked, they mentioned the Chesapeake Bay Foundation has had great success using some of the same strategy of working with landowners and farmers. Asked if you've worked with them. Probably not so much. Andy's based out in Nebraska, but they mentioned, for example, how to manage water sources on your property to control livestock access to water sources to prevent erosion and too many nutrients in the water. Have you got maybe some other partnerships or that might be that you've been drawing on? It looks like certainly
Yeah, especially in like the UK, I've been asking them a lot about it since they've been doing a lot of work there. But actually, Cynthia, if you wouldn't mind, if you have some contact information or the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, I'd love to have a conversation with them because I'm always eager to learn and find new innovative ways that are working for others and things. It's like we don't want to obviously keep reinventing the proverbial wheel. So if others are having successes elsewhere, I'd love to meet with folks and chat about ideas. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Great. I think the next one came in on here on the left. Jenny asked, what funding sources are typically used in Nebraska for this?
or in regards to the conservation cooperatives, so that's something that would be more of conservation professionals, organizations working together with those landowners through conservation programs per se. So to fund like an actual cooperative per se, that's something we haven't really explored at the moment. I think that's kind of an initiative that we look to into the future, but a lot of it would probably be more around these conservation programs that are currently available out there. So,
And most of those conservation programs being Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS
correct.
programs.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
In
Good
case that was
point.
what you were
Yes.
referring to
Yep.
there, Jenny, as well.
Yep.
Um, Wayne turned on his video. Wayne, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to talk. I can read it off if you'd like. You're currently muted though.
Go,
There you go.
go ahead
Here,
and
go
read
ahead.
it. I think some of this has been answered. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, he asked, how do cooperatives identify and then procure whatever financial support is necessary to, for example, take land out of production for conservation purposes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to kind of get them identified or started, a lot of it ends up just being kind of local initiatives, folks that are, say, hey, I see these challenges that we're having. And that's where, when especially I talk to my folks or colleagues over in the UK, that's what they refer to a lot. It's, producers are recognizing these challenges and saying, hey, how do we fix some of these things? Because, growing up in Pennsylvania, for example, I have a lot of friends that are still there, basically took over their family farms back there, and they want to ensure the sustainability of those farms, but they also need at the same time to be, financially, they want to be in the black, they don't want to be in the red. So finding ways to make the maximum amount of money that they can, so that kind of that economics drives a lot of that decision making for them. And again, markets are a significant component of that. So it's really kind of it's really a local effort, I guess you could say, if you want to say grassroots, maybe kind of, but it also is in combination where you have these conservation professionals who are working in those areas and they are meeting with producers and they recognize that these producers are saying, hey, this is, there's folks that are wanting to get to work together, and they may not necessarily be, 15 landowners to start. It could be literally two people that are, have adjacent lands, and they're like, hey, can we do something? And then they start building that momentum to then start expanding that out. And to your point on the funding, like I mentioned, or Jenny, it's primarily through those conservation programs. If they're doing like say a CP43 Prairie Strip initiative, but it's also getting the farmers to. I think the thing I'm always excited about is that in looking at some of these other initiatives around the world, getting the producers to then talk with their peers and say, hey, this worked or this didn't work, and here's how we would recommend. It's that peer-to-peer learning. And the more we can facilitate and encourage that, I think the better. And I think it's like anything else in society. The more you can encourage that type of peer-to-peer engagement, the better success you'll end up having. So, but it's not easy. It's definitely can be complicated. You may have two landowners that don't like each other too. So that makes it additionally complicating. So.
Yeah, this is
Okay.
something that I was going to ask as well. Is you mentioned landowner-led, the importance of landowner-led aspects to this, and do you find that sometimes maybe it's just sometimes somebody might be afraid of taking the lead on something like this?
Sure.
How much do you see the role of like yourself or some sort of a conservation professional sort of just facilitating the event and getting, putting something on the calendar and sort of doing the announcement aspects to it?
Sure.
And without and maybe guiding some of the agenda, but allowing it to be led by landowners. Have you played around? Have you seen landowners self-organize, I guess, on their own?
Yeah, I think well, we obviously as a society are all busy, and so taking an initiative on yourself can be a challenge. I think that from my perspective, I think that's one of the roles that, Luke, you and I within Extension have, is that connection point. And I actually, as part of these meetings, I think one of the things that's been really cool from the conservation professional side is they're like, I didn't even know University Extension was an opportunity to, work with around some of these initiatives. Are there ways that we could partner and kind of, engage? Because one of the things that UNL, like for example, UNL Extension, we do a lot of work, and I'm sure Luke does within Extension in Maryland. You have a lot of our traditional extensions working in the realm of like, beef production or crop production. So they're obviously already meeting with these landowners that are, you're wanting to kind of meet with. And so that's kind of led to some of these ideas or discussions around a landowner-led workshop, where then you could then bring conservation professionals, talk about the various conservation programs. I find that fairly often is there's so many different programs that landowners can almost get overwhelmed by the all the different programs that are available, and that's where I think it's important to have those conversations together and seeing, hey, this really worked well for me on my property, and then maybe would this potentially work well over here on mine, and that's where kind of the extension and conservation professionals can help in some of that guidance. So Luke, hopefully that answered your
Yeah,
question.
that helps. Yeah, that helps. One thing I always try to do at my workshops is to leave ample time for breaks for people to also just interact and get to know each other. I feel like it does serve some of that purpose for people connecting up.
Yeah, and I think it's so important, especially with COVID and how we all we're isolated, and I hear it all the time, and I think it's that's why we termed it conservation connecting points, because we're trying to connect people together at these various levels, and hopefully, and actually some of the feedback we received from that meeting in April, which led to that landowner workshop discussion, was we need landowners here too. We need to and ultimately that meeting could balloon up to be hundreds of people, and which would be awesome. And hopefully we're starting to think about the next steps to plan for the future for other events. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, one last question, maybe a couple more. Anthony Antonucci also asks us, are there some issues with climate change, where there's drought, wildfires, extreme weather, that might help get the attention of farmers for buy-in and getting some of these conservation practices going?
Yeah, that's a great question, Anthony. So I know, so here in Nebraska, we actually have, it's called the Center for Resiliency and Agricultural Working Landscapes, or CRAWL is the acronym. We're very good in the natural resource field coming up with acronyms. But with that being said, they focus a lot on trying to work with landowners around things like climate change, like these extreme weather events that are happening. And we actually have another initiative here in Nebraska. And I'm just kind of speaking Nebraska because that's what I'm most familiar with. We have a thing that's called Ready Weather Farms. A colleague of mine, Nathan Mueller, who's an extension specialist, leads that. He's basically an agronomist, but he works in basically developing educational material and helping producers be prepared as much as they can for the changing conditions that we're seeing in our climate. And thinking, kind of having, if you want to say plan B, C, D, E, all these different kind of backup plans, because as you guys know, you just don't know how the conditions are going to be in the coming years. And so trying to be as kind of, forward thinking, if you want to say, I think that would probably be a good term for it. So yes, there are initiatives there that I'm familiar with to work with farmers. I think that's important that those initiatives continue to be expanded. And Nathan in particular, his initiative is focused with farmers. So he's helping them get these weather-ready farms. And they walk through kind of almost like an accreditation type, program, educational program. So.
Cool. That was our last question. Cynthia shared a cool
awesome. Thank you,
the Mountains to Bay Grazing Alliance, which
awesome.
I want to get in touch with them. Thanks for sharing that, Cynthia, because I heard about them early on and I have not actually engaged with them directly, but I think rotational grazing or grazing in general can be a great tool for managing some of our early successional habitats and keeping them from succeeding into later stages. So I definitely want to connect with those. So thanks for sharing that resource.
Thank you.
Cool. Well, thank you, Andy. Appreciate you sharing. It's been really great. Take a moment, everybody. I'm going to pop in the chat that evaluation survey. You can give us feedback, ideas for the future, talks you'd like to have coming up in September. We're booking for September. So put your feedback in there and we can get somebody you like.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for joining. Thank you, Andy, and we will talk to you all soon.
Yeah, thanks again. I really appreciate the opportunity to come join today.
Great. All right, everybody. Have a good one.